Thank you, everybody, and welcome to the panel. I'm very excited here to be moderating this panel on digitalization and its key issue for the future of work. We know it will have an impact on women's employability and development, and so delighted to have such an amazing panel. Let me start by introducing them. So first of all, we have Susana Ayarza, is a marketing director for Google Brazil and global director for Primer, Google's digital marketing and business learning app. She has more than 20 years of solid marketing experience and has led important diversity and inclusion initiatives. She's an active member of Google's Women's Committee in Brazil and is a mentor and facilitator for many development programs for female Googlers. Welcome.
Thank you.
Then we have Ana Cristina Riaz, is Article 19 Mexico and Central America's regional director since May 2006, and is a columnist of Simbargo.mx. She has worked in the Right to Information Office of Mexico's National Commission for Human Rights and has a vast experience collaborating in various human rights organizations both in Mexico and Brazil. Welcome.
Thank you.
We have also, to her right, we have Mira Grazia Squizzarini, is a senior economist, head of unit within OECD's Directorate for Science, Technology, and Innovation. She specializes in statistical, empirical, and policy analysis related to economic growth and productivity, intellectual property rights, global value chains, jobs and skills, the digital transformation, and gender. She's the leading author of OECD's report, which supported the G20 presidency to bolster the evidence base and draw attention to critical areas for policy action for equitable participation of women in the digital economy. Welcome. And finally, we have Nneka Henry, who is an advisor to the executive director of the International Trade Center since 2013. In that capacity, with over 10 years' experience in trade and development, she provides substantive support in managing the priorities, agenda, and workflow of the executive director's office, particularly as it relates to women's economic empowerment, donor relations, and interinstitutional cooperation. Welcome. It's lovely to have all of you here discussing this important issue. I'm going to kick off with you, Susana. So we know that women make up half of the world's working age population, but generate only 37% of GDP. How do you think we can increase the economic participation of women around the world using technology? How can we address this?
So thank you. I'm very excited to be here. Actually, the no-hill panel, but still powerful. So I'm from Chile, and Chile is a very sexist country. I lived for several years in El Salvador, Central America, and I have been living for the last 11 years in Brazil. And these countries are very sexist in general, but even though that, I think this is changing. I'm not optimist. So thinking about technology, I do believe that this is a major force and has a very positive impact on economies by, for example, giving access to learning, to knowledge, by lowering down the barriers for small businesses to start their own new projects. And but the bad thing, and what it is really a shame, is that not everyone has access to these kind of tools. And we know that women are really underrepresented when we think about online, when we think about internet. So this is something that obviously we need to change. We do believe that if we help women to have the very best of technology, we are not only impacting women, but we are also impacting their families, their communities, and the society at scale. So, for example, in countries like India, India is a huge market, is a huge country. They have the second largest population online. But when we think about women, they only have 30% of women with internet access. And if we think about the rural areas, this number drops to 12%. So it's very, very low. So we, as in Google, we obviously saw the opportunity to really help to move the needle there. And we launched a digital literacy program, a global program called Women Will. And we are training internet satis or partners, so these women are training other women to get them online. And online to do what? To basically understand about better farming techniques, to understand about the government bureaucracy, and also, for example, to take just a selfie. So this is a program that I'm very proud of. I have examples from an internet sati called Lakshmi. She was able to stop a child marriage because she knew about the law. She demonstrated to the family that was illegal because of the information in her phone. So, and this is a program that is impacting several women in India. Actually, until now, since 2015, 13 million women have been impacted by this program. But even though that India is struggling with poverty, we can see that this gender gap is not only an issue in India. We have more developed countries like Japan, for example. There, 2 in 3 women don't come back to work after having a baby. So there we are helping the companies, and we are helping women there so they can have more flexible policies, more flexible work processes, so women can easily come back after having their babies and maybe working from home and still being productive, okay? But what about us in Latin America? In Latin America, we have a very high unemployment rate for women, even though that we have more formal education than men. And I have a very close example. This is Brazil. Brazil has 30% more unemployed women than men. So this is obviously a huge challenge for us. So there we launched Women Will. The idea was to really empower women so they can find a job, change careers, or start their own business. The great learning was that it is not enough just to share with them digital skills. We need to go further, so we're training them on soft skills like self-confidence, leadership, communication, and also obviously digital skills. And obviously to scale this, it has been very important, all the partnerships that we have through Google.org and with the grants, for example in Brazil with Rede Mulher Empreendedora, with Laboratoria across the region, Sulabatsu in Central America. So they are helping us to really move the needle faster. But obviously this is something that we're not going to change so quickly. Obviously we need to act on that, and no government by their own or no NGO is going to solve it for themselves. So we need to act together. We need to act now. And technology can help on that. The technology can really help us to help each other. But we need to obviously do it now, because if we want to see an impact on our daughters, this is the time, to have a change for their lives now and for their own daughters. So that's why I think technology is super important.
Great, thank you so much. And just sort of following on that, you've talked about the digital exclusion, the digital gender gap. Sonia talked about it as well. Anna, what do you think we can do to kind of ensure that we're addressing exclusion and making sure that women are digitally included?
Well, I will try to explain everything with a case. Article 19 is working in one of the most poorest communities in Mexico, which is an indigenous community, and we're focusing on women. And when we started working with them, we asked them, how do you feel before men? And they say, I feel small. So we asked them, why do you feel small? And they say, because they have more information than I do. So we started working with them and asked them what kind of information would they need. And we understood that the first thing that they do not know was what information was. Actually, in indigenous languages in Mexico, in the southern Mexico, information is not a word, nor internet, nor freedom. So we have to deconstruct the concept of internet, word, information, and freedom. And what we understand is that they understood internet as an invisible library or a network of voices after we did a set of of things. And one of the things that we did was that we identified that the most information that they needed was information related to health, information related to education, but also information related to their lands. So they started asking about the doctor of their community. They wanted to know why the doctor did not come to the community, why the medicines would not come to the community. And they asked through the internet and through the access to information law, what was the budget for that medical center in that community. So they found out that the doctor was assigned there and supposed to earn around $1,000 per month, and that he was also receiving money for the medications that they were not receiving. So women came into the assembly that they were not allowed to participate because women are not allowed to participate in the indigenous assemblies, and they come with the information and they said, we need to do something. So they raised around 700 signatures from the different parts of the community, asking for the repeal of the doctor that was there, that was making corruption. And from that moment on, the authorities, the indigenous authorities from that community and from other communities start asking women to start asking questions to the government in order to improve the way they live. So digital inclusion for Article 19 is not only a thing about women participating in social debate or public matters. It's a way also to change and save lives. In this moment, most of the women that live there, that used to have horrible problems to go to the doctor, that have to walk 2 hours being pregnant to go to a doctor, now they can go to a doctor that actually has the control from women. You know, like they check, they have a paper, and the doctor has to sign that he's there. He has to sign about the medicines that they have. And this is because a process of digitalization. So what we think is that we cannot see only internet or digitalization process as a economic transformation. We do think that digitalization process means a social transformation that transform exclusion to inclusion, that transform actually the way that women behave in social matters. Right now, when we ask these women, how do you feel in front of men? They will say, I feel the same, and I even know that I might have more information that they have. And one of the things that we learn is that it's not only about freedom, the freedom that you exercise socially, but also how you feel free when you are able to have information. And as Susan said, in Mexico, many indigenous women don't have access to internet, but they don't even speak Spanish. So it is important also that in the digitalization process, we think about shifting of seeing women as consumers of internet, but also make them able to create their own contents. Right now, all contents in the internet are made by white men from the global north, and without any considerations of how women can act and participate through the internet, even though internet has become a megaphone for women, for their demands, for the accountability of their rights.
Right, thanks. And Maria Grizia, we know that education is key. It's a key enabler. What does your research tell us about the impact of education?
Well, first of all, let me take the opportunity to thank Argentina for organizing this, what I call the We20 Summit, because it's really about us. And let me put forward let me set the framework, like, what is the digitalization about? Well, it's encompassing every step of our life nowadays. It's about our life, our work, and the way we learn, and the way we interact. And the other truth that I would like to put forward here is we don't know what the future of work will look like. So having said that, the question is how to be prepared for it. Well, we know from existing studies that what you need to have by the time you don't know what the future looks like is really foundational skills. Literacy, numeracy, because getting information, understanding them, linking content in the digital era means an ability, a visual spatial ability to look for the right information, retain it, and digest it and use it. And then, this then raises the question, are girls prepared for it? Well, unfortunately, the answer is a black and white kind of portrait, because we do know from the assessment we have done in the context of the OECD PISA assessment that girls typically have lower visual spatial ability, and they feel much less confident by the time, for instance, mathematics are involved. So what we also know is that women typically perform less well than men in problem solving in technology-rich environments, and also have poorer navigation skills. And this goes exactly in line of what my colleagues before were saying. What we also know, though, and that's why I said, it's a black and white picture, is that in the era of the internet, where everything is getting more interactive and more collaborative, well, then girls perform better than boys in terms of collaborative problem solving. However, by the time you put a girl, in front of solving a problem on her own, she feels a bit more lost than a boy would do. So we really have to, through education, try to supply girls and women with the skills needed for the digital transformation. Then the question becomes, is because they do different studies? Well, to some extent, the answer is yes. That is, 3/4 of the people that study tertiary education in education itself are women. But by the time we look at people getting a degree in engineering or ICT, we are talking about a mere 1/4 of the graduates. Now, the statistics vary by the time we look at secondary education, tertiary education, but the truth of the matter is that the expectation that people have about girls do matter for what they do in their careers. So we do have evidence that, for instance, by the time we look at boys and girls aged 15, 10 times as many boys expect to have a career in ICT as compared to girls. And girls think of themselves in terms of nurses, typically. So they are 3 times as likely to try and do studies in health studies rather than in other fields. Another big thing that I think we need to address is self-confidence. Girls typically panic in front of mathematical problems. And this is regardless of actual performance. So 2 people performing exactly the same way, well or bad, typically see girls fearing it much more. And parents have expectations about their kids, and they expect 2 to 3 times more to have their boys go into STEM careers rather than their girls. And finally, I think this is something to think about. We know for sometimes girls have been much more proficient, for instance, in literacy, which means that when in school, when advised about a career, teachers typically tell girls that they could go and they should go towards literacy-related study because that's what they excel at. But then what they don't take into account is consideration about prospect career developments. So I think the picture is really black and white, and we need to act on several issues and several domains.
It's very interesting, thank you. Nick, I'm going to come to you now. We've heard a lot about the sort of inequalities and so. What do you think are the main actions, if you were to do a call to action, the main actions that we need to take to address this issue?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. Just to build on what Maria Grazia was saying, there's a lot of statistics, and it's about the internet user gap, which exists as well. It's actually growing. It's increasing. We have now a gap of 12% in developed countries, and if you look in developing countries, it's as high as 33%. So this is quite, it's discouraging that this gap is actually growing instead of decreasing. And just building on what the panel has already said in terms of the gaps, I think in this regard, some of the key actions that we can be looking at is, first of all, linked to the skills building and education. I think we should be challenging ourselves, government, civil society, private sector, to promote and provide more STEM programs, specifically targeting women. I think that's one key area to first look at, including advanced digital skills in entrepreneurship so that women can take advantage of that going into the future. And building on that, I think it's also important to promote better access to these programs because many of them do exist already, but we have to ask ourselves, how are they publicized? Where are they taking place? Is it a safe and easily accessible place for women to go to? Is there some childcare being provided so they can attend the sessions and their child being taken care of? the cost. So we have to think about these issues about providing better access to these kinds of programs. And I think it's also important that once we equip women with the skills, I mean, we should be able to promote and ensure that there are some channels for access to markets, for example. It's good to have the skills, but if there is really no government procuring contracts, looking at women, or the private sector is not concerned about supply diversity, then that's also a huge issue. So aside from the hard infrastructure points about making sure that people actually have access to the internet in the first place, I think these soft infrastructure issues also need to be addressed.
Great, thanks. I'm going to try and squeeze in a round of final comments because you have all such interesting to say. I'd like to come back to you, Senna, about what you think we can do to make sure women are left behind. And I'm also going to ask you to there's a question from the audience. Sonia had mentioned earlier that new technologies are gender neutral. So what do you think can be done to ensure that new technological development does not increase inequalities?
Well, inclusion is a business imperative for us. We have been doing this during the last 20 years. Since the very beginning, we have believed that obviously we need to have inclusive technology. So for example, giving access, democratizing the access to information through search, or YouTube, for example, a platform that gives a voice to everyone, or for example, projects like Loon that were using balloons instead of building a super big infrastructure, and we are bringing internet to very remote areas in different parts of the world. But however, we know that inclusion is much more than access. And we know that, and this is a big challenge for us if we want to really imagine and develop products or technology that can be inclusive, we need diverse teams. And this is something that we are lacking at Google. We know that, for example, when we think about women or people of color, especially in engineering, there are some gaps that obviously we need to improve. So when we look at, as I said, at our own home, there are some challenges that we are trying to address. For example, now we are trying to hire people from underrepresented groups, or trying to really have a very inclusive and diverse culture and environment inside the company. Actually, the first step, and this is something that it has been a very important part of our strategy, we launched our diversity annual report. So these are the numbers that are open, so you can see it online. And we have different representation groups at Google. Actually, I'm very engaged with these kind of groups. I'm a mother. I have 2 daughters, so I want them to have a better world, a more equal world, and this is something that obviously I want for all of us. So that's why I'm very engaged. I'm an active leader of Women at Google, a volunteer committee that we have there, where we advocate for gender inclusion, for not only in our company, but also in the society. And I also, obviously, I'm very involved. I'm also a career mentor of other women, because this is the way that I found to really deconstruct my own bias, because I have a lot. Actually, I was not so aware of that until I became a mother and I work at Google. So this has been very important for me as a person. But obviously, I think it is not enough. I would love to have, or to have this when I was starting my career, and to have this kind of advice in terms of seeing what was right and what was wrong. Just to give you an example, in a past job, I was not included in the strategic meetings because the meetings were on Saturdays during golf sessions. And for me, at that moment, because golf is for men, at least I thought that at that moment, it was normal, So this is something that obviously I'm learning. I'm trying to share that with obviously my teams. And as a marketing director, I'm also in a journey toward a more inclusive marketing. Just to give you an idea, across the industry, 37% of the people that appear in the ads are women. And most of the time in stereotypes, like at the kitchen, cleaning, or taking care of kids. So that's not great. 85% of women think that these ads don't represent their real world lives. And actually, our own ads, we have a lot of diversity in terms of race, but when we think about the people that we have in our own ads, these people seem to live or like to work in tech or to live in very hip and urban neighborhoods. So this is something that obviously we need to change. We want to build for everyone. That's why we need to actively pursue inclusion, and not only for us, but also for our partners. So when you are in a meeting with your advertising agency and you are the only woman in the room, this is something that you need to change. You need to be very critical, and you need to ask the questions and act. This is our responsibility. Constantly ask and try to change things.
Thanks. Thanks. And unfortunately, we are going to ask each of you to keep your comments relatively short because we're running out of time. But you talked a lot about diversity, and so I want to move to you, Anna. You work with a lot of journalists and communicators. How do we ensure that there's diversity in women in that space? Because that's a key component also of some of this diversity.
Well, the first thing I will say is that the internet is a threat for those that want to maintain the things as they are. And women have to have the chance to break this glass ceiling with the internet. You don't have to become an opinion leader with men in the head of a newspaper now. You can be an opinion leader through the internet. So that means that women, journalists, have become a target for all that establishment. And they are subject to threats. They want them to send them back to their houses. And most of the women, or most of the threats that journalist women face, are related to a thinking that is that they should not be talking about what is manly or is supposed to be manly. So in this scenario, what I would think is that it is important to understand that the openness, the anonymity, and the possibility of encryptation gives the opportunity to women to maintain themselves there. We have seen in Mexico as the most dangerous place to exercise journalists that women are targeted constantly, but not only to them, they are targeting their families. And this creates zones of silence, and we should not permit that.
Yeah, very important. As I could say, I just want to come back to you because you spoke a lot about education. We have a lot of questions on education, and I'm sure you'll take them at the break. But I'd like to ask you also about not just education, but the role of women in innovation and in this space, in this digital sector. What are your views?
Well, unfortunately, the bad news is that the role is marginal. If I have to synthesize what is the result of the analysis, it's both by the time we look at technological innovation, as for instance can be proxied by patent applications, or we look at software, the role of women is really marginal. So, for instance, the latest figures we have is that, well, although there is some hope because over the last years compared to 20 years ago, the proportion of women that are involved in innovative activity has grown, although it's grown from 5.6% to 8.4%. So we're really talking about very little numbers. And what I think is very scary is the fact that by the time we look at how the groups of inventors are organized, we see that, for instance, about 80% is men-only inventors. You have 4% that is women-only inventors. And then you have, a group that is about 16% that is in the middle, so there are mixed groups. And unfortunately, figures are as bad, or perhaps even worse, and I'm smiling because it really hurts to see them, that when it comes to software, for instance, we did analysis on open source software, because of course proprietary software is much more difficult to get data about. And we see that women are really very few present. So for instance, among the top 1,000 coders in R, which is a very common software to use, only 92 out of 1,000 are women. And by the time you look at the networks, that is the way they interact with the other authors and where they are located in inventive activity, well, they are in the outskirts. So they're not even at the core of the development. This is really scary because despite the progress, as I said, the proportion of women contributing to both innovations and software has been growing, the pace is so slow that I think that in the case of technological innovation, if the pace continues to be the one we see today, we will need to get to 2080 to see 49% of the innovations either being generated by women-only teams or mixed teams. The rest will be men only. And we're talking about more than 60 years from now. So I think we really need to act, because the problem of not being involved in innovation is twofold. On one hand, women are missing on current opportunities, but they are not even shaping the future. And we know how important software, algorithms, data are and will be more and more for artificial intelligence, machine learning. And by the time women are not included, and this is true for women, but for all kind of diversity type of ranges, the problem is that the algorithms will replicate biases, both conscious and unconscious, and the future will not be any better than what we see today.
Great. Those are very scary figures.
Yeah.
So I'm going to turn to Neka, who you ITC focuses on trade and entrepreneurs. Is it better there? What do you see as the future in terms of women and technology in that space?
Well, let me say I'm from the land of Usain Bolt, but I'll see how I can manage my response in less than 0 minutes, which is what I have. I'll say this, I think it's very promising, the future of trade for women. And I say this because of the direction we're heading in right now. In terms of women who are trading in business now, they're exporting, we find that there's 1 in 5 businesses that are women-owned who are operating traditionally offline, but then that number doubles when we look online, and we're finding 3 to 4 out of 5 women are actually owning businesses trading online. So I think that's a promising trend, and I think in the future we can be expecting that technology will help women to be exporting and trading regionally and internationally, bypassing some cultural and social norms in a much easier way, especially since the identity, the gender is kind of hidden when you're trading online. I think a second thing I'd like to mention quickly is that we see also a trend of marketization of unpaid work. So there's more and more unpaid work now becoming paid through digitalization. And we're talking about things like childcare and early child education, cleaning, cooking. Things are now being sort of marketed online. Digitalization is helping us to now put a price on those kinds of jobs. So I'll end there and say that for us, I think it's a promising future for women.
Well, I'm glad that we've ended on a slightly positive note. And I'd like to thank the panelists so much for your contribution. It's been a really rich and a deep discussion. I know there was a lot of questions we didn't have to answer, but they'll be around, I'm sure, if you want to grab them. So thank you so much.